All right, let's tackle section 4. Here we go. There's the focus question. For Americans, the challenges to obtaining real independence, as opposed to declaring it, were enormous, and Britain, which saw the colonists as rebellious traitors, was determined to crush them. The new American army faced the greatest military power in the world with a well trained, professional, disciplined army, augmented by hired soldiers from German states such as Hesse, the world's most powerful navy, and experienced military commanders. The Americans had local militias and a poorly equipped continental army, many of whom were undisciplined and no navy to speak of, although it did charter privateers, or private ships allowed by the Congress to attack British naval and commercial ships. Yet many of Americans had military experience, particularly those who fought in the Seven Years' War or had militia training. Americans were fighting on their own soil for a revolutionary cause that inspired sacrifice and devotion. During the war's 8 years, some 200,000 men served in the Continental Army as volunteers or in the militia, where service was required of every able bodied man. By the war's end, 1 in 20 of the free white male population in the colonies between the ages of 16 and 45 had died, the equivalent of nearly 3 million deaths in today's population. But the hope for independence survived as long as an American army existed. The British learned that despite their power, the conquest of 13 colonies was an enormous and expensive endeavor, which might require higher taxes than Britons in the mother country would resent. The British made a series of mistakes, misjudging the degree of support for independence among Americans and the capacity of American citizen soldiers. European rivals, particularly France, welcomed British defeat and could equalize the balance of forces in the struggle if they supported America. Although George Washington at first would not accept black recruits in the Continental Army, he reversed this policy after a British proclamation offered freedom to enslaved people from Virginia who escaped and served in the British military. Around 5,000 blacks enlisted in the American Army and militia, some of whom were enslaved and promised freedom if they served as substitutes for their master or his son. Blacks fighting under George Washington served in racially integrated units, the last black Americans to do so in regular units until the Korean War. Except for South Carolina and Georgia, the southern colonies also enrolled free blacks and enslaved blacks to fight. While these colonies did not explicitly promise the enslaved blacks their freedom, many received it individually once the war concluded, at which time Virginia emancipated enslaved blacks who had served in the American Army. But many hundreds of blacks, particularly enslaved blacks, found freedom and opportunity by enlisting in the British military. Even 17 of George Washington's enslaved people fled British lines and joined the fight against the American colonists. The sluggish prosecution of the war by the British commanders and Washington's determination to avoid direct confrontation in order to buy time to gain international support and to prevent the destruction of the American army made for an inconclusive beginning to the war. Though the British captured New York in 1776 and pushed the Americans back through New Jersey, Washington saved a demoralized and shrinking army in successful surprise attacks in that state, at Trenton in December 1776 and at Princeton in January 1777. In October 1777, a second British army, advancing south from Canada into New York to isolate New England from the rest of the colonies, was surrounded, defeated, and forced to surrender at Saratoga. While the British Army remained quartered in New York, American troops suffered a punishing winter at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. But the victory at Saratoga helped persuade the French in 1778 to recognize the United States and supply it with military assistance. Spain soon joined the war on the American side as well. Though these allies first limited their attacks, the entry of France into the war in particular forced Britain to defend not only America, but much of its global empire, and significantly weakened its capacity to wage war in North America. The American Revolution became a global war by the late 1770s. France, Spain, and the Netherlands signed American treaties and attacked the British around the world. European attacks helped to distract and reduce British forces and resources. These other countries also helped to finance the war. Despite the proclamation of 1763, colonists had continued to move westward, leading Indian tribes to complain of intrusions on their land. Many Patriot leaders, including George Washington, were deeply involved in Western land speculation. About 200,000 Native Americans lived east of the Mississippi River in 1790. Like white Americans, Indians were divided in allegiance during the Revolutionary War. Indians chose whichever side they felt would advance their own ideas of liberty. Many tribes tried to maintain neutrality only to see themselves break into pro American and pro British factions. In 1778, the center of the war moved to the southern colonies, where the British hoped to take advantage of social tensions between frontier farmers and wealthy planters, enlist the many loyalists in the region, and disrupt the economy by encouraging enslaved people to escape. By 1780, British forces had occupied Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina, and seemed to control much of the South. This year was perhaps the lowest point of the war for the Americans. Congress was essentially bankrupt, and the Army, without pay for several months, experienced several mutinies. More and more, loyalists were flocking to British lines along with tens of thousands of enslaved people. But irregular warfare launched by colonial militias in the South and a brutal civil war in much of North and South Carolina and Georgia between patriot and loyalist militias, with both sides committing atrocities and destroying property, failed to crush the rebellion in the South. Furthermore, brutal treatment of civilians by forces under Colonel Banastre Tarleton persuaded more Americans to join the Patriot cause. Finally, in 1781, defeats and costly campaigns weakened British forces there commanded by Lord Cornwallis, who moved his army to Yorktown, located on a Virginia peninsula. Washington rushed his forces there and with French troops laid a siege, which, when supported by a French naval blockade, forced Cornwallis to surrender his army there in October 1781. Imperial rivalry among Europe's great colonial powers had helped create the American colonies, and now it secured their independence as a new nation. After Cornwallis's defeat, public support for the war collapsed in Great Britain, where many thought the West Indies were more valuable and merchants hoped to renew trade with America. In 1783, Great Britain recognized America's independence in the Treaty of Paris and ceded the entire area between Canada and Florida east of the Mississippi River. At British insistence, the Americans promised not to persecute loyalists and to restore to them property seized in the war, but many loyalists left for Great Britain, Canada, or other parts of the empire. Until independence, the 13 colonies in North America had been only part of Britain's empire in the Western Hemisphere. In Canada and the West Indies, where planters feared slave revolts, colonists refused Americans' appeal to join the war against the mother country. But with the Treaty of Paris, the United States of America became the first independent nation in the hemisphere, reflecting in its boundaries not the unity of a region, but the circumstances of its birth. So that's the end of section 4, and I'll see you guys next time.